It started as an ordinary day in a small, peaceful town, but what happened next was anything but ordinary. A group of teenagers, all from well-off families, found themselves in the middle of a situation that would change their lives forever. In the middle of a quiet cemetery, surrounded by nothing but the whispers of the wind and the towering gravestones, an elderly woman sat inside an open grave, looking up with a mix of confusion and fear. The teenagers stood above her with shovels in hand, their laughter and nervous energy filling the air. At first glance, it looked like a cruel and heartless act, but appearances can be deceiving. Who was this elderly woman, and how did she end up in such a shocking situation? More importantly, why were these teenagers involved? The story isn't as simple as it seems. Beneath the surface lies a web of unexpected twists, raw emotions, and lessons that no one could have seen coming. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the tension in the cemetery grew heavier. The woman, despite her vulnerable position, held a strength in her eyes that hinted at a deeper story. The teenagers, on the other hand, seemed caught between a mix of panic and guilt, as though they were grappling with the weight of their own choices. What led to this shocking moment, and how did everything spiral out of control? The truth behind this unsettling scene is something that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about compassion, justice, and the ripple effects of our actions. Stay tuned, because what unfolds next will leave you speechless. The story begins a few days earlier in the same quiet town where nothing much ever happens. The elderly woman, Miss Etta, was well known in the community. She had lived there for decades, always smiling, always kind, and full of stories about her life. But she was also someone people often overlooked, a quiet presence in a busy world. That is, until this strange incident thrust her into the center of attention in the most unexpected way. The teenagers involved were a group of friends who often hung out together, looking for ways to pass the time in their sleepy town. They weren't bad kids, but like many teens, they had a knack for taking things too far without considering the consequences. What started as an idea for a harmless prank quickly spiraled into something much bigger than they ever intended. They never imagined their actions would lead to someone like Miss Etta sitting in a grave. As details about the night began to surface, it became clear that there was more to this story than anyone could have guessed. Miss Etta hadn't simply stumbled into the cemetery or been forced there without reason. She had agreed to come, but why? The teens claimed it was all part of a strange, spontaneous dare, but even their version of events left too many unanswered questions. What was the real reason Miss Etta was there, and why did she go along with it? The townspeople were baffled when they found out, but Miss Etta's calm demeanor throughout it all made them wonder if she knew something they didn't. What seemed like a cruel joke was beginning to look like something much more complex. The truth was lurking just below the surface, waiting to come to light. As word spread about what happened that night, the town couldn't stop talking. Everyone seemed to have their own theory. Some believed the teenagers were just reckless, playing a prank that went too far. Others whispered about old stories involving Miss Etta, tales of her wisdom, her resilience, and even rumors of secrets she kept locked away. But no one could piece it all together. How could these kids, who barely knew her, end up tangled in a moment so strange, so unsettling? Meanwhile, the teenagers were starting to feel the weight of what they had done. At first, they had laughed it off, convincing themselves it was just a joke. But the image of Miss Etta sitting calmly in that grave, her steady gaze meeting theirs, refused to leave their minds. Each of them felt it in a different way. One of them, Jason, started avoiding the group altogether, the guilt pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. Another, Emma, kept replaying Miss Etta's words in her head, soft-spoken but firm, as if she knew something they didn't. Miss Etta, on the other hand, didn't seem angry. In fact, she barely spoke about the incident at all. When neighbors checked on her, she'd smile gently and wave them off, saying, "Things like this happen for a reason." But her quiet response only deepened the mystery. Why wasn't she upset? Why hadn't she told anyone what led her to that grave? It was as if she was waiting for something to unfold, like she knew this was only the beginning. The parents of the teenagers tried to smooth things over, apologizing on behalf of their kids. But Miss Etta didn't want an apology. What she wanted, it seemed, was something none of them could understand yet. And that's when people started to notice Miss Etta wasn't just forgiving, she seemed determined. Whatever had happened that night wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The days following the incident brought an eerie shift to the town. The teenagers, once inseparable, began to fracture under the pressure. Jason couldn't sleep, haunted by nightmares of Miss Etta's steady, unflinching gaze. Emma, usually the most light-hearted of the group, started avoiding conversations altogether, her thoughts consumed by guilt and confusion. The others tried to laugh it off, but even they couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play. Miss Etta, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had happened, or at least that's how it seemed. But there was something in her movements, a quiet certainty that didn't go unnoticed. She spent more time walking through town, talking to people she hadn't spoken to in years, her voice calm and steady. It was as though she was preparing for something, but no one could figure out what. When people asked her about the teenagers, she would only smile and say, "They'll find their way." Her words were cryptic, almost too calm, and they only added to the growing unease. Then, something strange began to happen. The teenagers, each in their own way, started to experience things they couldn't explain. Jason swore he saw Miss Etta standing outside his house late one night, even though she denied ever being there. Emma found a small folded note in her locker at school, written in handwriting she didn't recognize, that simply read, "You know what you need to do." The others began noticing subtle but unsettling things, sounds that shouldn't be there, feelings they couldn't explain. It was as if the world around them was shifting, pushing them towards something they didn't understand. The tension reached a breaking point when Miss Etta invited all the teenagers to her home. None of them wanted to go, but somehow, they felt like they had no choice. They arrived one by one, unsure of what to expect, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. Miss Etta greeted them at the door, her calm presence only making the air feel heavier. Inside, the room was dimly lit, her walls lined with photographs and objects that seemed to hold stories of their own. She asked them to sit and began to speak, her voice steady, but filled with a weight that silenced the room. "You've all been carrying something heavy," she began, her eyes moving from one face to the next. "But tonight, you'll learn what this is really about." The teenagers exchanged nervous glances, their hearts racing. Whatever they had stepped into, it was bigger than they had imagined. And as Miss Etta's words grew heavier, the tension in the room thickened, setting the stage for something none of them could have foreseen. The teenagers sat frozen, their breaths shallow as Miss Etta's voice filled the room. She spoke calmly, but every word seemed to land with an unshakable weight. "What happened that night wasn't just an accident," she began, her gaze piercing through their unease. "It was meant to happen. You were all meant to be there. And now, you're part of something bigger than you understand." Her words left them speechless, each of them wrestling with the growing sense that they were caught in something far beyond their control. Then, she stood and moved toward a shelf on the far wall. She picked up an old, weathered box, its edges frayed from years of wear, and placed it on the table. "This belonged to someone very important to me," she said, her tone softening, but still laced with mystery. The teenagers leaned forward, their curiosity outweighing their fear. When she opened the box, they saw a collection of items that seemed unrelated, a faded photograph, a small wooden carving, and a piece of paper covered in handwriting that none of them could read. Miss Etta explained that the items were remnants of her past, tied to choices and sacrifices made long before they were born. "What you did that night," she said, looking directly at Jason, "wasn't just a prank. It triggered something, a thread that was waiting to be pulled." Jason shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. But then she revealed something that none of them expected. "You're not the first to stand where you stood," she said, her voice carrying an edge of sadness. "And you won't be the last." The room fell silent as her meaning sank in. This wasn't just about them. Whatever they had done, it was tied to a history they knew nothing about, a cycle that had been playing out for generations. Before they could ask what she meant, the door creaked open behind them. They turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, someone none of them recognized, but who seemed to know exactly who they were. The figure's presence filled the room with a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. And as Miss Etta's calm demeanor finally faltered, the teenagers realized they were in far deeper than they. The room went silent as the figure stepped into the light, their expression unreadable, but their presence commanding attention. The teenagers stared, unsure whether to feel fear or relief. Miss Etta broke the tension with a deep breath, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "This is Samuel," she said quietly. "He's here to help you understand." Samuel nodded, his gaze moving across the room. He carried an air of familiarity, as if he'd been part of this story all along, hidden in the shadows. Samuel explained that what the teenagers thought was a reckless prank had unknowingly tied them to a legacy they couldn't ignore. Miss Etta, he revealed, had been waiting for the right moment to bring them together. The grave they had dug wasn't meant for her. It symbolized a burden she'd carried for years, one tied to her family's past and the town's hidden history. The teenagers weren't chosen by chance. Their actions had activated something Miss Etta and Samuel had long prepared for. Miss Etta looked at each of them, her eyes softening. "You didn't mean harm, but your choices have consequences. Now you have a chance to set things right." She handed them the items from the box, explaining how each represented a step toward restoring balance. As they listened, guilt gave way to determination. They realized they had a role to play, not as villains, but as participants in something greater. Over the coming days, they worked together, guided by Miss Etta and Samuel. Each step revealed new truths about themselves, their town, and the connections between them all. By the end, the grave wasn't a symbol of harm, but of rebirth, a reminder that even the deepest mistakes can lead to growth. When it was all over, Miss Etta smiled at the group. "You've done well," she said, her voice filled with pride. The teenagers left that night changed, carrying with them not just the weight of their actions, but the understanding of their power to make things right. And as they walked away, the town, once steeped in quiet secrets, began to feel lighter, its hidden stories finally laid to rest.